1 meter and 80 centimeters is the approximate wingspan of an apex predator that dominates the tropical canopy with absolute precision. This raptor possesses talons capable of exerting pressure equal to the grip of a grizzly bear, transforming a feathered creature into a specialized biological instrument of the rainforest. Why was this specific predator introduced to a restricted island ecosystem like Barro Colorado? In the center of Lake Gatun, Panama, the completion of the Panama Canal in 1914 fundamentally altered the landscape, isolating a piece of land that became a closed laboratory. Scientists assigned the eagle a role as a natural regulatory force to stabilize a collapsing environment, yet the results deviated sharply from the original calculations. The restoration of the former king of the forest canopy seemed logical to observers at the time. One can notice how the disappearance of major terrestrial and aerial predators over several decades fractured the existing natural order. Engineers and biologists believed that reintroducing a top-tier hunter would force the ecosystem to recalibrate itself through natural selection and pressure. However, the anticipated equilibrium did not arrive as planned, and the return of the predator triggered a systematic massacre among the local wildlife populations. It is visible how the closed boundaries of the island turned a supposed sanctuary into a contained arena of constant conflict. The process of rebalancing is only gaining momentum, but in reality, the intervention revealed the extreme volatility of isolated habitats when apex predators are reintroduced without gradual stages. The eagle did not merely hunt to survive, it began to reshape the entire demographic structure of the island through relentless predation. Everything only gets more complicated as researchers analyze the specific behaviors that led to this ecological disruption. The transformation of Barro Colorado from a protected laboratory into a site of uncontrolled slaughter provides a stark technical record of what occurs when an apex predator is placed back into a fractured chain. One can notice how the balance shifted too far, too quickly, leaving the environment in a state of permanent instability. Thus, the steel-like grip of the eagle on the island's ecology continues to be studied as a definitive example of failed biological regulation. Eighth Wonder of the Modern World is a title frequently attributed to the Panama Canal due to the sheer scale of its engineering. Why did the United States decide to dam the massive Chagres River during the construction of this monumental project? This decision led to the formation of Lake Gatun, which at the time of its creation spanned an area of more than 430 square kilometers. The answer lies in the necessity to create a navigable waterway through the heart of the Isthmus of Panama. One can notice how the water levels stabilized to form what was once the largest artificial lake on the entire planet. But this is just the beginning. Engineers diverted the natural flow of the Chagres River with massive earthen dams. The equipment gradually reshaped the geography of the region to ensure a constant supply of water for the lock systems. It only looks obvious that a passage was needed, but in reality, the maritime impact was revolutionary for global logistics. A ship traveling between New York and San Francisco previously faced a journey of more than 22,000 kilometers around the treacherous waters of Cape Horn. The process of circumnavigating the continent is only gaining momentum until the canal enters the equation. Thanks to this passage, that distance was reduced to only about 9,500 kilometers. 13,000 kilometers are saved during a single transit through the canal. This reduction translates directly into a saving of 2 to 3 weeks of travel time for every large vessel. Million-dollar sums in fuel costs are preserved for shipping companies as the camera glides along the hulls of these steel giants entering the locks. Everything only gets more complicated as the volume of traffic increases each decade. 5 to 6% of the entire global maritime trade currently passes through this narrow corridor. On average, 14,000 to 15,000 ship transits are recorded annually. Direct revenue from these operations generates more than $4 billion every single year for the nation of Panama. Transition to the next level. The national budget relies heavily on these funds, turning this small country into a strategic choke point within the global supply chain. But such industrial power comes at a price in the form of permanent changes to the natural landscape. One can notice how the rising waters submerge tens of thousands of hectares of tropical rainforest. It seems simple to create a reservoir, but in reality, the creation of Lake Gatun fragmented the ecosystem. What was once a continuous forest is now a mosaic of lake islands surrounded by water. The equipment and infrastructure remain in constant operation to maintain this artificial balance. Thus, the steel and concrete of the canal define the modern geography of the region. 1,500 hectares of land emerged from the rising waters during the monumental construction of the Panama Canal. This massive engineering feat inadvertently created Barro Colorado Island, often referred to as BCI, when the flooding of Lake Gatun transformed the highest remaining hills into isolated landmasses. Why did this specific island become the focal point for global tropical science? Since 1923, the location has served as a specialized biological research station, eventually becoming one of the most intensively and continuously studied rainforest sites on the entire planet. It was selected for its unique isolation and perceived ecological integrity. The camera glides along the perimeter where dense vegetation and abundant wildlife create the appearance of a flourishing, intact ecosystem. One can notice how the lush canopy layers suggest a perfect success story of nature shielded from direct human interference. However, by the late 1970s, after more than 50 years of detailed observation, researchers encountered a grim technical reality. It seems simple to assume that protecting a forest ensures its health, but in reality, total safety acts as a direct enemy to the mechanisms of evolution. When the constant pressure from predators was removed due to the island's limited size and isolation, the fundamental rule of survival of the fittest effectively stalled. The forest structure began to shift from within because the most critical predatory links in the biological chain had been severed. Everything only gets more complicated when analyzing the internal dynamics. The ecosystem functioned like a biological zombie, appearing stable on the surface, while its evolutionary engine had ceased to operate. Scientists observed the slow decay of natural selection as the lack of external threats prevented the necessary culling of the weak. One can notice the subtle changes in species distribution and the lack of traditional forest renewal cycles during this period. The process of ecological stasis only looks obvious upon close inspection of the data gathered over those decades. The material collected by researchers confirmed that without the tension of predation, the forest loses its ability to adapt and maintain its structural complexity. This stage of the study concluded with the understanding that an isolated sanctuary can unintentionally become a site of biological stagnation. From here, the investigation into the long-term survival of fragmented habitats moves toward a more complex phase of ecological management. 3 to 5 times higher is the density of howler monkeys on the island of Barro Colorado compared to the mainland forests of Panama, where large predators still roam. With their natural enemies completely absent from the ecosystem, the local primates, specifically howler monkeys and white-faced capuchins, entered a period of rapid and unchecked population growth. Why did this sudden demographic explosion occur so violently? In a standard environment, predators act as a regulatory mechanism, but on this isolated island, that pressure vanished entirely. This absence allowed primate numbers per square kilometer to climb to levels that ecologists now categorize as exceeding the natural biological carrying capacity of the tropical rainforest. One can notice how their vocalizations echoed across the landscape, no longer functioning as cautious warnings of danger, but instead signaling a state of absolute environmental dominance. The foraging troops expanded their operational ranges, systematically exploiting every available nutrient source, including young leaves, ripe fruits, and the most delicate newly sprouting shoots. It gets more complex further on. Longitudinal studies focusing on forest regeneration at the research station recorded a severe and measurable decline in the survival rates of young seedlings. For several specific shade-tolerant tree species, the data indicated that the number of saplings successfully reaching full maturity dropped by more than 70% when compared to control forests located on the mainland. The camera glides along the dense canopy where the sight of crowded monkey populations was initially interpreted as a triumphant symbol of successful conservation. At first glance, the bustling activity in the trees seemed like a sign of a thriving ecosystem, but in reality, a darker ecological trend was beginning to manifest. Excessive population densities triggered intense internal competition for resources and a marked increase in aggressive social behaviors within the troops. Most critically, the long-term isolation of the population led to a steady decline in genetic diversity, weakening the overall resilience of the species. Scientists eventually recognized that this was not the profile of a healthy or sustainable biological community. Instead, the island had produced a biological population bubble, and according to the fundamental laws of nature, every bubble eventually reaches a point where it must burst. The process of ecological overextension concludes this phase, leaving the forest in a state of precarious imbalance. 1990 is the approximate year when scientists on the island of Barro Colorado began to observe a subtle but steady decline in primate populations. Why did these animal groups begin to dwindle despite the absence of external threats? It would seem that a lack of predators would ensure a demographic explosion. But without a natural check on their numbers, the internal mechanics of the ecosystem triggered a different and more destructive process. Observations revealed that the population had exceeded the carrying capacity of the island territory. One can notice how the high density of individuals led to the rapid spread of various diseases across the forest canopy. At first glance, the environment remained stable, but in reality, the biological pressure was mounting. Food resources grew steadily poorer as thousands of individuals competed for the same limited botanical supply. The process is only gaining momentum. Researchers recorded a decline in overall health and reproductive success among the primates. This degradation occurred without a single sign of predation or obvious interspecies conflict. The camera glides along the lush green foliage that still covered the island, masking the internal collapse of the system. It only looks obvious that a green forest provides plenty, but the nutritional value of the available biomass had reached a critical minimum. Internal imbalances alone proved sufficient to destabilize the entire population structure. This safe paradise entered a state of slow and silent degradation caused by its own success. The equipment gradually documented the weakening of the social and biological units within the primate groups. It gets more complex further on. The ecosystem began to slip under the weight of its own inhabitants. No external force was required to push the population toward this downward trajectory. Thus, the biological decline on the island reached a state of self-sustaining decay. One of the key stages of this ecological observation concludes with the realization that balance is more vital than safety. 2 meters is the approximate wingspan of the Harpy Eagle, a raptor re-emerging as the apex predator to stabilize a failing rainforest ecosystem. Why was this specific bird chosen to occupy the highest regulatory tier in Central America? At first glance, the reintroduction of a predator seems like a simple biological addition, but in reality, it is a calculated effort to restore a natural hierarchy that had been absent for generations. This bird was once the undisputed king of the skies, and its return to the canopy marks a fundamental shift in the regional environmental balance. The process of re-engagement is only gaining momentum. One can notice how the physical structure of this raptor is engineered for total domination within the dense forest canopy. The talons of the Harpy Eagle stretch over 13 centimeters in length, making them larger than the claws of a grizzly bear and capable of exerting immense pressure. These biological tools allow it to hunt in a realm where no other predator can truly rival its efficiency or power. It is visible how the bird maneuvers through thick branches despite its massive size, maintaining a specialized role that other species cannot fulfill. The arrival of these eagles on Barro Colorado signifies that the era of artificial safety for prey species has officially ended. But this is just the beginning. Scientists do not simply release the birds and leave them to chance. Each individual is carefully raised under controlled conditions before being reintroduced. They are fitted with sophisticated tracking devices that record data on every flight and every successful hunt. The equipment gradually compiles a detailed map of how the eagles interact with their environment, providing researchers with precise insights into the restoration of the ecosystem. It only looks obvious that the birds would thrive, but in reality, monitoring their movements is critical for understanding the recovery of the forest. The tracking sensors continue to transmit signals as the raptors establish their territories. Everything only gets more complicated as the birds begin to influence the behavior of other animals, effectively reshaping the biological landscape from the top down. The Harpy Eagle settles into its role as the dominant force of the canopy, and the data collection continues without interruption. This stage of the ecological restoration project concludes with the birds successfully reclaiming their ancestral hunting grounds. 10,000 hectares of primary rainforest is the minimum territory required for a single breeding pair of harpy eagles to hunt, nest, and successfully raise their offspring. Why did these dominant birds disappear from their ancestral lands, necessitating a complex reintroduction program? The answer is found in the shared tragedy that faces almost all apex predators when their environment is altered. These massive eagles are physically incapable of surviving in small or fragmented patches of forest, as they depend exclusively on vast and unbroken tracts of greenery. But this is just the beginning. Deforestation and the immense construction of the Panama Canal shattered the once continuous habitat into isolated and disconnected fragments. By the mid-20th century, the harpy eagle had nearly vanished from the territory of Panama due to this loss of space. It only looks obvious that the loss of one species is a singular event, but in reality, when the king of the canopy fell, the entire ecological kingdom it once protected began to weaken immediately. One can notice how the biological structure of the forest relies on the presence of its top predator to maintain balance. The process of decline is only gaining momentum once the apex of the food chain is removed. Saving the harpy eagle is therefore not merely a project focused on the conservation of a single magnificent bird. It is a calculated effort to preserve the very soul and functional integrity of the rainforest. The equipment of nature requires every component to be in place to prevent a total collapse of the biological system. It is visible how the forest thrives when the largest wingspan in the canopy returns to its rightful position. Everything only gets more complicated when the delicate layers of the ecosystem are left without their primary guardian. Ensuring the survival of this species is the foundation for stabilizing the entire region. The restoration of the predator marks a transition to a more stable phase for the surrounding environment. 50% is the hunting success rate achieved by female harpy eagles during the initial phase of their reintroduction into the ecosystem. Why did the arrival of these raptors completely destabilize the existing hierarchy of the Barro Forest in Colorado? It seems simple to assume the primates would remain masters of the canopy, but in reality, the howler monkeys and capuchins found themselves exposed as primary targets the moment the eagles spread their wings. Tracking devices attached to the birds revealed a harsh biological truth regarding the vulnerability of the resident monkey troops. The predators do not rely on loud, prolonged chases to secure a kill. One can notice how a harpy eagle remains perfectly motionless on a sturdy branch for several hours at a time, blending into the shadows of the upper canopy. Everything only gets more complicated for the prey, as the eagle utilizes its razor-sharp eyes to pierce through multiple layers of dense tropical foliage. These birds are professional ambush killers that wait for the exact microsecond of vulnerability. Statistics confirm that while females maintain a success rate of nearly 50%, the smaller males successfully strike their targets in approximately 35 to 40% of their attempts. But this is just the beginning of the impact on the local primate population. On average, a single eagle secures a fresh kill every 3 to 5 days to maintain its metabolic requirements. The prey composition consists primarily of howler monkeys, who were once accustomed to lounging atop the highest treetops to bask in the sunlight, along with white-faced capuchins and slow-moving sloths. The process is only gaining momentum as the raptors refine their territories. It is visible how the monkeys have transitioned from a state of relaxation to one of constant vigilance as the aerial threat persists. The eagles strike with such speed that the primates often have no time to initiate defensive maneuvers or alarm calls. Each successful hunt reinforces the raptor's dominance over the forest's vertical layers. The biological data continues to accumulate as the predators integrate into the food chain. This concludes the initial observation of the confrontation between the new aerial rulers and the forest floor inhabitants. 100% of the survival strategy within the forest changed following the introduction of the apex predator. Why did the disappearance of only a few individuals trigger a complete transformation of the entire landscape? It would seem that the loss of a small fraction of the population would have a negligible impact on the ecosystem, but in reality, the psychological presence of the harpy eagle fundamentally altered the spatial distribution of every living creature. Fear acts as a primal and absolute survival instinct that has officially returned to the canopy. One can notice how the primates no longer feed calmly in the highest reaches of the forest, where the youngest leaves and the most direct sunlight are found in greatest abundance. the monkeys began a strategic retreat to the lower levels of the vegetation. The process is only gaining momentum as the dense foliage provides a physical shield against the piercing gaze of the eagle. They became significantly quieter and more vigilant in every movement. Whenever a dark shadow sweeps across the treetops, entire troops immediately sound high-pitched alarms and vanish into the safety of the thick cover. This shift is the absolute essence of what biologists define as a trophic cascade. As the primates changed the specific locations where they fed, the constant grazing pressure on the upper canopy began to decrease. It gets more complex further on. This relief allowed plant species that had been overexploited for years to finally begin a period of recovery. One can see how seeds began to germinate in the now quiet branches. Small birds and various insects, which had previously been outcompeted for resources by the dominant monkeys, started to return to their original niches. The pervasive fear instilled by the Harpy Eagle became the invisible glue that reconnected the fragmented parts of the ecosystem. It is visible how this pressure forces every single organism to once again function within its proper ecological role. Thus, the biological balance reaches a state where the transformation moved to the next phase of natural stability. 30 to 40% of individuals in certain howler monkey troops vanished within the first few months of the predator's return. Why did the presence of a single bird species cause such a massive collapse in a flourishing rainforest? It only looks obvious that a hunter would reduce the population, but in reality, this decline targeted the mature adults who served as the critical pillars of the entire primate social structure. The ecosystem on Barro Colorado had existed in a distorted state for so long that the sudden reintroduction of an apex predator acted like pouring cold water into an overheated glass bowl. This biological shock did not stop at the primates themselves. One can notice how the loss of these monkeys immediately halted the movement of nutrients and life throughout the forest. The eagles did not merely hunt, they disrupted the essential seed dispersal for dozens of plant species that rely almost exclusively on these primates for their reproduction. Without the monkeys to carry seeds to new locations, the forest floor remained stagnant. But this is just the beginning. Other small animals had previously survived by utilizing the indirect protection of dense and loud monkey groups. These smaller species have now become secondary targets for the eagle's calculated strikes. It is visible how the Harpy Eagle maneuvers through the canopy with wings spanning 2 meters to reach prey that once felt secure. The rainforest did not find a quick path back to a stable equilibrium after the reintroduction. Instead, the entire habitat slipped into a new phase of ecological chaos where every interaction became unpredictable. The process is only gaining momentum. Scientists recorded these shifts through constant observation and data collection. Every loss of a social leader among the troops sent ripples through the smaller organisms and the vegetation alike. Transition to the next level of the study was required to map these cascading failures. Thus, the balance of the ecosystem continues to shift as the forest adapts to the presence of its ancient hunter. 100% of the implementation goals for the Harpy Eagle reintroduction project on Barro Island were met before the operation faced a mandatory suspension. Why was such a technically successful biological initiative halted despite achieving its primary ecological objectives? Scientists initially believed the isolated terrain would suffice, but the reality of the bird's physical scale proved otherwise. The island territory consisted of too few square kilometers to contain a predator of this magnitude within its natural boundaries. The eagles began navigating beyond the established geographical limits of the island, frequently venturing into nearby human settlements. This movement pattern created a direct conflict with local populations and placed the birds at an immediate risk of being shot by residents. But this is just the beginning. Long-term genetic viability for a stable population was impossible to maintain within such a fragmented and restricted landmass. One can notice how the biological data gradually revealed that the apex predators required a much larger range to avoid the complications of inbreeding. It only looks obvious to release a species into a protected zone, but in reality, the scale of the habitat must match the physiological demands of the bird. Scientists observed that the Harpy Eagle functioned as a highly efficient ecological police force during its residency. However, they realized that researchers could not simply release such a powerful predator into a confined space and expect the environment to repair itself without further intervention. Everything only gets more complicated when the limits of the ecosystem are reached. The experiment concluded with a high degree of professional regret among the research teams. Transition to the next level of understanding occurred as the project generated a trove of invaluable scientific data. It demonstrated that modern conservation is not solely about the preservation of individual species that remain in the wild. It is visible how the focus shifted toward protecting the entire web of complex relationships within the environment. The process is only gaining momentum as ecologists analyze the data from this suspension. Often, the true value of these biological connections is only fully recognized once they have completely disappeared from the landscape. Thus ends one of the key stages of the apex predator reintroduction study. From here, the scientific findings move into the next phase of global conservation planning without haste. One case study of Barro Colorado is not an isolated occurrence in the history of environmental management. It represents just one instance among many attempts to correct complex ecosystems that have been thrown off course by specific human actions. Why do similar efforts in different conditions lead to completely opposite outcomes? One might assume that the same biological intervention would yield a predictable result across various landscapes. But in reality, the success of such an operation depends entirely on the hidden mechanics of the surrounding environment. The most famous example occurs in Yellowstone National Park, where the reintroduction of gray wolves in the mid-1990s became a global symbol of successful ecological restoration. What is striking is that the physical act of reintroduction itself was essentially the same in both locations. In both Yellowstone and Barro Colorado, humans brought back an apex predator with the exact same goal of restoring a natural order that had been disrupted decades prior. Yet the outcomes were radically different in their long-term impact. One system gradually rebalanced over time through a series of natural adjustments, while the other was forced to halt the experiment entirely to prevent further collapse. It is visible how the same strategy can produce divergent paths of evolution. The difference lay not in the specific species being reintroduced, but in the broader ecological context of the land. Yellowstone is an open system that is vast, well-connected, and spacious enough for species to adapt to new pressures. But this is just the beginning. Barro Colorado, by contrast, is small, isolated, and forced to change far too quickly for its inhabitants to survive. The camera glides along the boundaries of these two distinct worlds, revealing why one flourished while the other failed under the weight of its own borders. This contrast leads to a core lesson that dictates modern conservation strategy. In the field of ecological restoration, there is no one-size-fits-all solution that can be applied universally to every forest or park. A decision that is right for one ecosystem can become a serious mistake in another if it is made without a full understanding of scale, connectivity, and natural limits. Everything only gets more complicated as the scale of human intervention grows. The process of learning from these differences allows for more precise management of the natural world in the future. 100% of the ecological collapse in Barro Colorado serves as a physical testament to the reality that natural systems are not mechanical assemblies that can be taken apart and reconstructed by human intervention. Why does an environment devoid of its natural apex predators eventually transform into a lethal trap for every living organism within it? It seems simple at first glance to remove a perceived threat to create a safe haven. But in reality, the absence of population control triggers a catastrophic chain reaction where the explosion of herbivore numbers leads to the total depletion of vegetation. One can notice how the balance of the terrain shifts when the natural hierarchy is dismantled. Without the pressure of hunters, the local species consume the plant life down to the bare soil, causing the entire ecosystem to enter a state of slow, irreversible degradation. It is visible how the lack of biological checks turns a supposed sanctuary into a silent death sentence for the landscape. The process is only gaining momentum as the soil loses its stability and the water sources begin to dry up without the protection of forest cover. The equipment of modern science records these shifts with absolute precision. This outcome demonstrates that the removal of a single link from the biological chain carries consequences that are impossible to correct through simple technical means. But this is just the beginning of understanding how fragile these systems truly are. Every action taken to simplify nature results in a more complex and uncontrollable failure of the environment. The story of this region concludes with a quiet observation of what remains when human interference exceeds the limits of natural recovery. The land enters a calm but stagnant phase of existence where the original diversity is lost. Thus, the analysis of this environmental transformation reaches its conclusion, leaving the evidence of the cycle to remain as it is.